Last time we were struggling with the debate between so-called internalism and externalism, and this basically has to do with the relation of language, mind, and reality. And the Frege-Russell tradition is challenged by a whole series of arguments. The Frege-Russell tradition takes for granted, they don't even explicitly argue for it, it takes for granted that the resources of the mind are adequate to explain how language relates to reality. So if you refer to the President of the United States, it's because in your mind you have a certain set of meanings attached to those expressions, and those meanings are sufficient to enable your utterance of the expression to refer. Now, I think that view is exactly right, but you have to make some qualifications to it. Often, what's in any individual's mind is not going to be enough. He or she has to depend on other people. So if I hear you say, we met Cadwallaby at the party last night, and I never heard the name Cadwallaby before, I assume there's some person, some male or female named Cadwallaby. If it turns out Cadwallaby is a prime number, then I'm out of luck. But I take for granted that you know what you're talking about, and I can even pick up the reference. I can even use the same name you did to ask questions about the person you were talking about, even though I know nothing about this person. I call such cases parasitic, and they're really quite common. For example, we all talk about things like nicotine and cholesterol, but if asked to give a definition of those words, I don't have the faintest idea. Nicotine is something that's in cigarettes that apparently makes them fun to smoke. God knows, I never found any fun smoking them. And I guess people who chew tobacco, maybe that's what makes it fun to chew. What a thought. In any case, I rely, as Putnam would say, I rely on experts. But that's hardly a big deal for the theory of language. That hardly shows that language, that the linguistic resources are not in the mind. It's just that in a community of speakers, you have to rely on other speakers. But with that in mind, remembering that often one's use of a word is parasitic on other people's, you're dependent on other people, and also you will try to make your usage conform to that of other people. By the way, that doesn't always work. Sometimes the child will say something, and the family thinks it's a cute thing to say, so they'll pick it up and start using it. My little brother was an undergraduate at Harvard before he found out that the word sandwich was not a word of English. He said it when he was a little kid, and we picked it up, and we said, let's have a sandwich for lunch. It became a sort of private Searle family usage of the word, and this sometimes happens. The story that's told about the Spaniards, I don't know if it's true, but I'm sorry if it's not true, is the reason they do that lisp, which you don't get in Mexican Spanish, is there was some Spanish king who had a lisp, and so everybody thought they had to imitate the guy's lisp. And thus you get what to us people brought up on Mexican Spanish, or at least Western Hemisphere Spanish, sound like an affectation or sound like an odd use of words. So you do get all sorts of variation, but the truth is there are few areas where conformity is so much required as it is in the use of language. And many people who pride themselves on their non-conformity are outraged at anybody who speaks English slightly differently. I am one. I cannot bear it when people use dangling participles. You know, that's the sort of thing like, lying in bed this morning, the alarm clock went off. Well, that's not good English. The alarm clock wasn't lying in bed. And I have a problem, even I have to confess, in some of your papers, that some people, even in this very room, are not clear that as is a conjunction, and like is a preposition. And my God, here I am trying to teach you about rigid designators, and some people are unclear about the distinction between like and as. Anyway, you'll get clear about that before the final exam. So now we have the struggle between internalism. I guess I'm one of the last of the Mohicans of internalism. No, Chomsky also is an internalist. Chomsky and I don't agree on very much. After my last review of his book in the New York Review of Books, I'm not sure we're on speaking terms anymore. But in any case, we both think the resources of the mind, or if you like, the collection of minds, have to be adequate to account for the use of language, because you haven't got anything else to go on. Speaking of language is an ability, and the resources of the mind have to be adequate, otherwise you're not going to be able to account for it. Okay, so now let's consider the famous arguments against internalism. And I'll be repeating some of the stuff I said before, and I hope I won't bore you too much. But I have discovered in many decades of teaching that repetition is not always a bad pedagogical technique. Probably the most famous single argument, one that Melissa will no doubt have told you about in her sections over and over, is the twin earth argument. And it's slightly embarrassing, I think, to Hilary Putnam, because it's his most famous, he's a very good philosopher, it's his most famous achievement. But last time I saw him, he told me he no longer agreed with it. But anyway, we're stuck with stuff, whether or not we still agree with it. But anyway, here's how the argument goes. You remember, it's perfectly possible to imagine that in a distant galaxy, people have the same thing in their heads as we do, or they did in 1750 before anything was known about chemistry. But all the same, the stuff that they talk about when they use the word water is different from what we talk about, because it has a different chemical composition. Now, says Putnam, what that shows is meanings just ain't in the head. I don't think it shows any such a thing, but I think we have to answer the argument. Let's accept the intuition. Let's accept his inclination to say that, well, they mean something different by water, even though the same thing in their head, because the stuff that they call water isn't really water. It's a kind of fool's water because it's XYZ and not H2O. Now, you do pay a price for that, because it means their beer isn't really beer and their ice cream isn't really ice cream. And I don't know about mud, if their mud is really mud, because our mud, as far as I'm concerned, is made of water. If you had a mud made out of beer, well, I don't know. Is that real mud? I'm not sure. But anyway, we don't care too much about mud. We care more about water than mud. And for reasons I've never been quite clear about, Plato did not want to assign the universal forms to things like mud. It had to be more distinguished, more noble than mud. But anyway, we'll get out of the mud for a moment and look at Putnam's argument. Now, I think I'm going to be rather swift here, but I think there's an easy answer to the argument, and that's this. On his own account, the meaning is entirely internal to the head, because he said the way it actually works is we have an indexical definition. People say things like, this stuff here is water. And then water we will treat as anything that's identical in structure with the stuff that we have identified as this very stuff. Now, it's true that's an indexical definition, and it's an ostensive definition. Remember, an ostensive definition is one where you actually point to examples. This is a stool. I say, ostensively defining the word stool. So ostensive definitions, where you actually point to the thing which exemplifies the word you're defining, let's just leave it in adjectival form, the ostensive definition. And these ostensive definitions will be indexical, because they're always a matter of pointing at something. And you remember there's a special type of indexical, which is a demonstrative, where the actual pointing or some other demonstration is essential to the functioning of of the indexical. So if I say this piece of chalk, that's not only indexical, but it's a demonstrative. If I say last week's lecture, that's indexical, but not demonstrative. And if I say this thing is called chalk, that is an ostensive definition using a demonstrative indexical. I'm just saying all that to get the terminology straight. Okay, now what it seems to me that Putnam shows is that the Aristotelian idea that the way you get a definition of a word is by getting a checklist of the essential features. Man is a rational animal. Water is a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid. But that's not really adequate because you can have lots of things that satisfy that definition but aren't water. So what's his alternative? His alternative is to say, well, you indexically define water, and then that indexical definition is passed down from speaker to hearer and speaker to hearer. And sometimes you might discover that there is a kind of twin earth phenomenon where you discover the thing that you thought was unitary, in fact, comes in two different forms. And Putnam himself gives the example of jade. It turns out that jade has two different chemical compositions called jadeite and nephrite. And well, it's no big deal. And maybe if we're jewelers, we get worried about it. But effectively, we say there are two kinds of jade, jadeite and nephrite. And we might have gone that route with water, but Putnam is probably right that we wouldn't go that route, that we're attached to our chemistry, that H2O is a big deal to us because most of us are made up mostly of H2O, and H2O looms large in our universe. Okay, so it seems to me what Putnam succeeded in refuting was the checklist conception of definition. That what you get in a definition of a general term is a checklist of the kind: man is a rational animal, water is a colorless, tasteless liquid, and then various other features are given. Rather, it seems to me what he did is substitute for the checklist definition an indexical definition. But the indexical definition is entirely in the head. The indexical definition is entirely a matter of the cognitive resources we use. Now, when I say in the head, I don't mean that it's locked inside our skull. What I mean is that the resources of the mind are what are sufficient to enable me to identify a particular experience I have as one of perceiving water. So people say, this stuff is water. And other examples, this stuff is mercury, I say, pointing to the inside of a thermometer. And of course, as Wittgenstein told us, you've got to have an awful lot of resources to identify what's meant in an ostensive definition. So if I say, this is clerg, I'm going to define clerg ostensibly. Well, you still don't know what it means, because it could mean this shade of brown. It could mean this type of leather. It could mean this type of a briefcase. It could mean this particular briefcase, which I like so much, I call it clerg. I've given it a proper name. I'm fond of this briefcase. It was given to me by the Pope. I think I must have told you they invited me to give a lecture in the Vatican, and I accepted immediately before they discovered they'd made a mistake. A friend of mine also accepted immediately, Antonio Damasio, but when they found out, see, they had a tougher standard for Antonio because he was actually brought up a Catholic. So when they discovered his actual views, they withdrew the invitation. He wasn't there. I never had there was never any hope for my soul. So they let the invitation stand in my case. Anyway, so I decided I might name this John the 23rd. I mean, after one of my favorite popes. You could do that, but the point is the ostensive definition by itself does not tell you the meaning of the word. It only tells you the meaning of the word. It, so to speak, fills in the gap if you know all of the details about the meaning of the word. If this is called navy blue, well, then you have to guess that I'm talking about the particular shade. But of course, again, I could be talking about the shape or the shade or the type of handkerchief it is, or it could even be a proper name of a particular handkerchief. Okay, so just to summarize this point, it does not seem to me that the twin Earth argument refutes internalism. What it refutes is a checklist conception of definitions. And that was never any good anyway, if you think about it. I mean, the idea that man is defined as a rational animal, or humans are defined as rational animals, seems to me plainly wrong. There are other animals capable of reasoning. The famous case of the chimpanzees who there was a famous experiment conducted in 1917 where they figured out how to get the bananas, which were up high, by piling the furniture underneath and then climbing on top of the furniture with a stick and getting the bananas down. It was a case of using rationality. What's the name of that guy, the German psychologist who did that? I can't remember names anymore, but I'll come back to you with his name. God, now I won't sleep till I can find it on the web. In any case, it was a famous German psychologist who proved that chimpanzees are rational animals. And in fact, I don't think it's quite right to say water is defined as a clear, colorless, tasteless liquid. To begin with, it's not tasteless. It tastes like water. And I will demonstrate that to myself in case I had any doubts. Furthermore, it isn't entirely colorless. It looks like water. It's sort of watery colored. And also, it's still water even when it's frozen in the form of ice or floating around in the form of gas. So it's a lousy definition. What dictionary makers do is try to give you enough resources so you can figure out how to use the word. When I was in Oxford, I was frequently consulted by the guys who make the Oxford English Dictionary. What does this word mean in American English? What does that word mean in American English? And there are two words that all my friends ask me, what on earth does that mean? What is a duplex? And duplex is an oddity of American English. The British don't say duplex, they say semi-detached. It means exactly the same thing. It's a semi-detached house, it's a duplex. And another mystery of American English, which seems to be dying out, is the expression package store. We went to a package store to get a bottle of gin. And I don't know if the expression, now that you can buy booze everywhere, I doubt if package store will survive. But in the old days, there were institutions that sold alcohol, but it could not be drunk on the premises. You had to take it out in a bag or package. They were called package stores. And that was when it was a big deal to be able to buy alcohol. When I first came to this university, you could not buy alcohol within a mile of the campus. Now you can get it in the faculty club. I'll take you over for a drink after lecture. But that was at a time when alcohol was a big deal in American life. And the British do have an expression that means package store. It's called an off-license. And I could explain to you why those are exactly synonymous. Off-license means you have to drink it off the place which is licensed to sell it. Just as with a package store, you have to take it out of the store in a package before you can drink it. So these are oddities. But all of this is in the head, and not in individual heads, then in a collective head of the community. You don't refute Frege by showing that there are lots of people, each of us is one, that don't know the details about the meaning of words like cholesterol and nicotine, or for that matter, gasoline. I don't know what it's a hydrocarbon, but what exactly is the chemical composition that distinguishes gasoline from diesel fuel? Well, I know it when I try to start my car with it, but other than that, I have to rely on the experts. Putnam has another argument that I think is really a bad argument. I'm amazed that he thought he could get away with it. He's very smart. Here's how it goes. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, there are a lot of big trees, big deciduous trees. Some are elms and some are beeches. What's in my head regarding elm and beech? Pretty much the same thing. It's a great big tree that loses its leaves in the fall and gets them back again in the spring. But all the same, elms are not beeches and beeches are not elm. So what's in the head is insufficient to determine meaning, because the meaning of elm is different from the meaning of beech, but all the same, what's in my head is the same. Now, I think that's a poor argument, because the way that the argument is stated refutes it. Here's how it goes. In my head, what I have for elm and what I have for beech is the same concept, exactly the same concept. But all the same, I know that elms are not beeches and beeches are not elms. But then the question is, how do I know that? And the answer is, it's conceptual knowledge. I know part of my concept of elm is separate species of tree distinct from beech, just as part of my concept of beech is separate species of tree distinct from elm. So the actual formation of the argument presupposes its own falsehood. It presupposes that my concepts of elm and beech are distinct enough for me to know that elms are not beeches and beeches are not elms, a piece of conceptual knowledge, even though I can't go out on the street and tell you which is an elm and which is a beech. So that's a poor argument. And I think he's tried to answer me at some point about that one. But about the main argument, namely, my main argument against the twin earth, is that substituting an indexical definition for a checklist of general terms definition doesn't refute internalism. It just shifts the issue into what I think is a much more interesting issue, namely how indexicals work and how we learn to operate with words on the basis of indexical ostensive definitions. But again, to repeat Wittgenstein's point, you've got to have an awful lot of resources to make the indexical definition work. If I say this is called Bill, well, you don't know if it's the proper name of my cell phone or the color or the shape or the particular maker of the cell phone. It seems to me I just got this damn thing yesterday or a few days ago, but everybody tells me it's antique, it's positively ancient, must be all of 2 years old. But all right, anyhow, I am unimpressed by the twin earth argument, but let's go then to the next step and ask, well, what about the indexical argument? Because the indexicals are supposed to be a phenomenon for which internalism is supposed to be unable to account. Okay, questions about twin earth? Anybody want to visit twin earth? Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, so I think when Putnam says meanings aren't in the head, and when a lot of externalists say that, what they mean is just that semantic content doesn't supervene on inner physical properties.
Yeah, what is semantic content? You see, if it's semantic content means a checklist of definitions, a checklist of general terms, then that's probably right. Yeah.
Well, I think it just means that two beings that are physically identical can mean different things.
Yes, but
and
we.
In that
yeah.
sense, I guess maybe that isn't incompatible with Frege, but then it would be just to say that Frege isn't an internal definition.
Well, but let's go over it. You see, we know before any of this discussion got started that two beings that are physically identical can mean different things by the same utterance because, for example, if I say I am hungry and my doppelganger in Twin Berkeley on Twin Earth says I am hungry, he means something different. He's talking about him and I'm talking about me. Why? Because the expression is indexical. Now, what I'm suggesting is, what Putnam is showing is that there's an indexicality that affects all of language. And I think that's right. And indeed, that's a consequence of what I told you about the network and the background, is that all of your interpretation is relative to your network and to your background. So you get an indexical component in any use of a word. And that seems to me right. But that's not the same as showing that meanings are not in the head. You can have the same general concepts in the head of two different people who are physically identical, that is, who are, as philosophers like to say, molecule for molecule identical. You can have the same general concepts in the head, but all the same, they will mean something different. The word I is the same conceptual tool in both of them, but when they say, and each says, I am hungry, he refers to somebody different. But that's nothing new. Anybody who thought about indexical expressions knew that for a long time, namely that you and I learn a common word with a common meaning. I, this, that, there, today, yesterday, tomorrow, and yet different utterances of the same word with the same meaning will refer to different things. They'll mean something different. That's the point. Say some more, though, because it's an important issue.
What is it like you mean something different by meanings are in the head and Putnam?
Yeah, but I think Putnam Putnam has a false claim that he makes. He said nobody ever made the claim about indexicals that their meanings were in the head, and I want to say they are. The resources of the mind enable me to use indexicals in such a way that the same word with the same meaning will have different references depending on the context of the utterance. Today refers to today, but yesterday it didn't refer to today. Yesterday it referred to yesterday, even though it's the same word with the same meaning. Okay, but that only raises the next question. Well, what about indexicals? Don't they refute internalism? It seems to me, once again, they don't. And let's go through the two steps of the argument that we had in Perry and Kaplan. Perry more than Kaplan. And Perry says, correctly, there are utterances that are essentially indexical in the sense that you can't rewrite the utterance with that meaning without using an indexical expression. And I gave you famous examples of that. The guy who's spilling sugar in the supermarket, which is a good example, and also the guy who looks in the window and sees that there's somebody there whose pants are on fire, and then later on he discovers that it's not a window, it's a mirror, and his pants are on fire. Now, it's quite different for him to say in the same situation, that guy's pants are on fire, and oops, my pants are on fire, even though the situation is identical, and the pants, the indexical expression there is not eliminable. You can't get rid of it. Okay, that's the first claim. But the second claim is the one that's interesting to us now, and that is indexicals cannot be given an internal definition. The internal resources are not sufficient to account for this fact that the same word with the same meaning can have different references on different occasions and in different contexts. And there, it seems to me, they just made a mistake. And I think from talking to Perry that he agrees with me about this. Perry's argument was there is no completing Phrygian sense, that since the word means the same thing, when I say I am hungry and you say I am hungry, then there's nothing that distinguishes the two uses of the words except the fact that they're in different contexts. That is, they're uttered by two different people. So there's no completing Phrygian sense for the indexicals. I think there is. And the completing Phrygian sense is the self-reflexivity to the utterance itself. So it's part of understanding the word I that its utterance refers to whoever utters that very expression. That and it's part of the sense of the word today, that the person who utters that refers to the day of the utterance. Now, why exactly is that a completing Phrygian sense? What does a Phrygian sense do? It sets a condition. It sets a condition such that the object referred to will be referred to only if it satisfies that condition, and it's referred to, in fact, in virtue of the fact that it does satisfy that condition. But that's what happens with I and yesterday and today and tomorrow and you and last week and all those other examples. In each case, the utterance sets a condition, and that condition is a completing Phrygian sense. I refers to whoever utters it, and that means that the word I expresses a condition sufficient to determine the referent. But that's what a Phrygian sense does. It sets a condition sufficient to determine the referent. It's just that in these cases, the condition is reflexive to the utterance of the expression itself. And Russell, by the way, saw that. Russell had a good word for these. He called them token reflexives, because their utterance is reflexive to the very utterance of that token, to that particular token. So same type, I am hungry, said by me and said by you, but two different tokens of the word I, and those two different tokens have two different referents because the referent is reflexive to the utterance of the token itself. Now that raises an interesting question that I went over briefly, and that is, how many kinds of these are there that are lexicalized? How many different ways do we have of lexicalizing? By lexical, I mean defining a word in terms of this. How many ways do we have of defining a word in such a way that the reference to the utterance itself is encoded in the meaning of the word? And I found 4 different kinds, and those were utterance directional, I and you. Who's doing the talking and who's being talked at? Spatial, here and there. Temporal, yesterday and tomorrow. And then discoursal, words like former and latter. Now there are other things that are also indexical. The tenses of verbs are indexical. The past tense is indexical. We went to the store is indexed to a time before the utterance. So tenses of verbs are an example of a temporal indexical. Now some people maintain, Kaplan, for example, who writes more about this than anybody else, maintains that you ought to think of the world of the utterance as indicated indexical. So on that account, actual and possible are indexical to the world. So if I say, it's actually not raining today, though it did rain on Sunday, the index there is to this world as opposed to some other possible worlds. I think that is a totally unmotivated conception, though we'll have to say more about it when I get to the idea that the way to understand language is by understanding language as marking up different possible worlds. I think that is a source of a large amount of confusion in philosophy, but right now I'm arguing against a different kind of confusion called externalism. Okay, but anyway, I want you to understand that there are people who disagree with my claim that all indexicals that are lexicalized boil down to 4 different kinds. The utterance directional, the source of the utterance as opposed to the target of the utterance, I and you. The spatial coordinates of the utterance, as in here and there. The temporal coordinates, now, yesterday, tomorrow. And the discoursal coordinates, the former and the latter. Now you could imagine a language which had different kinds of relations indexicalized. If we all had perfect pitch, we might have an indexical expression that referred to this tone, and you might lexicalize that so there would be a word for tones above that and tones below that. If we were perfect musicians, and it was a big deal to us, we cared about it as much as we care about space and time. So there's nothing God-given, so to speak, about the 4 types that we have. We can easily imagine other kinds, but those are the kinds that I've found in every language. Well, I don't know very many languages, but in the languages that I know anything about, like French and German. Now, how does it work in Swahili and ancient Greek? It would be interesting to know. And I'm going to get a hold of my friend Dan Everett, the guy who investigated that tribe in the Amazon basin, who have this very peculiar language where, as I've told you before, they have no numerals. They can't count. They have no color expressions. They can't say it's red. They have to say it looks like blood. They don't have very many performative verbs, and it's interesting to see how they do the stuff they do when their language lacks the resources of our language. It's interesting that anthropologists have got themselves into a bind where they can't state the obvious facts. If you say, well, their language lacks the resources of most Indo-European languages, you mustn't say that. It's politically incorrect. It sounds like racism. Nothing of the sort. You're just saying it's a fact about their language, that they do these things and don't do these other things. But in any case, you do get in trouble nowadays. In the 19th century, the anthropologists were eager to prove Western civilization is superior to everything else. And then they became embarrassed by this sordid history. So now they can't say anything that suggests that the resources of some native language I used an incorrect word, primitive. My God, you mustn't say that either. That somehow or other those are less adequate. I think myself, you're in a hell of a bind if you can't count. And if it's politically incorrect to say that, well, then let's be politically incorrect, because they literally cannot count. And the way, I'll take a question in a second, the way that the anthropologists standardly deal with these cases is to say, well, they can sort of count. They have one too many. And they thought that about Dan's tribe, about the Piraha, I think it's pronounced. But in fact, he proved that that wasn't so. And that's kind of an interesting, I think I told you that, but it's worth repeating. The way that it standardly works is this. You go to the people in the tribe, and you say what you think to you means how many, and they'll say one. And then you put that one, and they'll say two. And then you put some more, and they'll say many. So they go one, two, many, many, many. Okay. But Everett proved that was a bad translation by starting over here with this whole thing. And they said many. So then he erased a couple of them, and they said, for what's left, two, which means that they didn't mean two the first time around. And then he knocks out a couple more, and they say one. So what was translated as one too many was a mistranslation. It meant some, more, lots more, but not one too many. They do not have numerals, and apparently they can't, the grown-ups can't learn numerals. The Portuguese-speaking traders come and rip them off pretty spectacularly because they can't count the money that they're getting. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. It's amazing that they can survive, because there are lots of languages in the Amazon basin, and they tend to interact more with other, I'm hesitant to say native Brazilians, because they're all native Brazilians, but they interact more with Portuguese-speaking Brazilians than do the Piraha. The Piraha think they are superior to everybody else, and that gives them a certain self-confidence. So Dan took one of his friends from the tribe into town, into Belize or somewhere, and took him to a store where they sold all this high-powered technological equipment, and showed him some of this stuff, television sets and computers and so on. And the guy said, you know, our medicine men could do this too if they wanted to, but we don't have the time. We're not going to waste our time on this kind of junk. So back to catching fish. In any case, there are, here's the point I'm arguing. The internalist account has no problem with indexicals. Now, maybe Mike is right to say, well, we ought not to think of it as internal, because, of course, the utterance of the word isn't internal to the head. I mean, I got to utter the word publicly so you can know what I'm talking about when I say I am hungry. But the point about here is not that it's between the ears. The point is that it's the resources, it's the representational resources in the cognitive capacity of individuals which is sufficient to fix reference. That's what's in dispute. And why is it important? Why do we care? Why is it such a big deal? Well, it determines the kind of approach we have to language and the conception we have of language. If it turns out that it is impossible to give what I call an internalist account of language, then a certain conception of linguistics is impossible. Then you could not account for how people relate language to reality. You'd have to wait and see how reality turned out. You wouldn't know what they meant by the word water until you'd done chemistry. I think we can know what they mean by the word water, even though we don't know even before we know the chemistry. What they mean by the word water is anything that has the same chemical structure as this kind of stuff. Later on, we discover that it's H2O. Okay. So I've now dealt with two major arguments against internalism, the twin earth argument and the essential indexical argument. Now, I made some rude remarks about Tyler Burge's arthritis argument, and I have great admiration for him. I think he's a wonderful philosopher. In fact, I tried very hard to get him to move to Berkeley, but for some reason, I don't know what it is. Why would anybody prefer Los Angeles? Well, anyway, there he is. And he has this argument that has been very influential, and that's the argument that says, what's in my head when I use arthritis will only refer to arthritis relative to the community. And this is proven by his example of the guy who has the same thing in his head. It's the same guy. But in one community, when he tells the doctor, "Doctor, I think I have arthritis," the doctor, who knows more etymology than apparently a lot of people do, knows perfectly well that can't be right. Arthritis refers to an inflammation of the joint. Itis means inflammation. Arth means joint. And so the doctor tells him, well, you can't have arthritis of the thigh. You can only have arthritis. Arthritis is an ailment of the joint. That's one community. Now, there's another community where, in that community, no, they do use the word arthritis to refer to muscle inflammations, and says, Burge, it must be the case that they have different beliefs, because one belief is true and the other one is false. The belief that he has arthritis is a false belief. The belief that he has arthritis, which they call arthritis, that's a true belief. Now, I think that is not a very powerful argument, but anyway, that's the argument. What it seems to me in this case is that the guy holds a false metalinguistic belief. He holds a false belief that ailments like this are called arthritis in my community. And you may remember I gave you the example about how, without knowing anything about what these words mean, I did kind of have the idea that women who were fat were called pregnant. So I said, at the age of whatever I was, 6 or whatever, I said, I think Sally's pregnant. I didn't really think Sally was pregnant because I didn't know what the word pregnant meant. And this guy didn't really think he had arthritis because he didn't know what arthritis meant. He knew he had a pain in his thigh, and he thought it was called arthritis. So I don't think that this is very threatening to the most naive version of internalism, because the guy does not have a false belief to the effect that he has arthritis. Rather, he has a false belief to the effect that the pain which he knows he has in his thigh is called arthritis in my community. Now, when I told this to Burge, he said, yes, but I'm just going to stipulate, it's his example, he can stipulate anything he wants, I'm just going to stipulate that the guy has no metalinguistic beliefs. He's not running around like a philosopher of language worrying about what words mean. And that seems to me fair enough. You can stipulate that. But everybody has to take for granted a background presupposition, namely, my words match the usage of words in my community. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to communicate. I have to presuppose that there is a commonality, and when I discover that my usage is different from other people in the community, I will alter my usage, as this guy did. So his assumption was not an explicit thought, arthritis means such and such, but rather it was a background presupposition. I am using arthritis in a way that's consistent with the usage in my community, and it turns out that was mistaken. So his mistake was not a mistake about the condition. See, contrast it with a case where a guy might really have a false belief to the effect that his thigh pain was arthritis. Imagine a guy who is the world's leading expert on arthritis, on inflammations of the joint. And this guy, this doctor, we'll suppose, thinks that he has discovered, in fact, the very same chemistry of the arthritic pain can spill over into the thigh muscle. So this guy thinks arthritis can exist in thigh muscles. Now that guy, I think, has a false belief. Later on in the medical journals, his view is refuted. He held a false belief that he had arthritis in his thigh. But there he really didn't know what the word meant. But in the case that we're imagining, the guy hasn't had the faintest idea what the word means. He just uses it in an odd way. And indeed, this often happens when you deal with doctors. If you're like me, you look up on Google what your symptoms are, and then you go and tell the doctor, I got so-and-so. And the doctor says, absolutely not. I was in Paris, and I had some ridiculous cough, and I did the dumb thing, which was Google all of my symptoms, and it turned out, oh my God, I got walking pneumonia, and I was convinced. So I went to a local doctor who was pretty good. I mean, whatever you may think of the French, their medical treatment, their medical education isn't bad. And I said to this guy, I told him in French, I said, I think I have the pneumonia. And he listened to me and he said, you don't have pneumonia. And I said, come on, you haven't even done a test. How the hell, And he said, Cartesians, I love Cartesians, he said, c'est certain. It's absolutely certain. That ended the discussion. He was right, of course. I didn't have pneumonia. But this, now I had a false belief because I didn't know something about the meaning of the word pneumonia. I was unlike Burge's arthritis guy. And this guy convinced me I did not have pneumonia. I couldn't have pneumonia. I'd had a pneumonia shot, for one thing. But in any case, beware of Google, because they will give you, they will make you an inadequate expert on all kinds of stuff that they print. Okay, so I've now dealt with three famous arguments: the twin earth argument, the indexical argument, and the arthritis argument. I'm just giving these labels. Let's go on, but let's take questions about any of these, because this is an important issue about the very nature of language and its relation to the mind and its relation to reality. And the argument, the point at issue is this: are the cognitive resources of human beings adequate to explain the relation of language and reality? And the internalist says, yes, they are, if you understand them properly. The externalist says no. The externalist says the relationship between language and reality is mediated by relations which are not represented in the mind. Just factual relations which are not in any sense represented in your cognitive capacities. Now, Putnam likes to say, the world takes over and decides what water is. It's not up to you. But of course, on the most naive Fregean view, the world takes over and decides what is the evening star, what is the murderer of Smith. So what the Fregean view is not that there aren't conditions in the world that have to be met. The Fregean view is that the mind sets the conditions, and those conditions do not necessarily need to be a checklist of general terms. Those conditions can be indexical conditions. They can make reference to other members of the community as well. Okay, questions about that? But I have to emphasize this. Most philosophers disagree with me. I think most philosophers buy what I think is a mistaken view, that the cognitive resources of the mind are not adequate. Yeah, do you want to say it? Mike? Yeah. Yeah, you can be the defender of the externalist.
So about, like, if you have that man or something,
yeah,
the internal condition is like being the cause of this experience.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But internally, then there's this sort of indexical to this experience, which probably just doesn't have a further condition associated with it.
Right. Now here's the point. You see, it isn't that there are no entities at all that figure in the determination of the condition of satisfaction. Utterances do, and the experiences do. The point is, are the resources of the brain, are the resources that you have as a human being, are those sufficient to fix reference? That's the question I'm asking. But a standard objection to me is to say, yeah, but even you admit there has to be the sounds, and that's part of the external world, and there has to be the experiences, and that's part of the world. Of course, but those are part of the system of representation which is cognitively represented. You've got in your brain the capacity to use words in specific occasions in ways that set conditions relative to those occasions. That's the point I'm making. So in a way, I mean, it's the usual thing in philosophy where we're partly talking at cross purposes. They're attacking a different view, and that's not the view I'm holding. I'm holding the view that the cognitive resources of actual people is sufficient to determine how language relates to reality. Often, in a typical case, one person isn't enough. you've got to appeal to other people and to experts. I am not sure. I mean, it's been so long since I studied any chemistry. I'm not sure what an ion is. I mean, I'm embarrassed. I'll go look it up immediately. For that one, I'll trust Wikipedia, though. God knows the stuff, the falsehood I find on Wikipedia. I once made a mistake of looking myself up on Wikipedia, and they have some wonderful falsehoods there. And somebody tried to correct them, but it didn't work because they reappeared again. And finally, somebody who worked with me said, "Look, forget it. People have a sort of a legendary picture. Don't fight it. Just go along with it." But in any case, so there are these collective resources that are available, and you appeal to those all the time with words where it's a technical term and you don't know the meaning. What exactly is the chemical structure of uranium? How many? What's its atomic number? I've forgotten, but I know there are people who know things like that. Okay, other questions now. We're going to go on with some more of these. I'd like to get to truth today because I'm kind of sick of reference, but it's mainstream philosophy of language. It has been the single greatest topic in the philosophy of language from Frege through Russell. Well, let's mention a couple of other attacks on internalism. Another attack is supposed to be the distinction between the de re and the de dicto, between the cases where the object itself is part of the intentional content or part of the meaning. And you remember I gave you the example about the guy at the beach. Ralph believes he is not a spy. About the guy in the brown hat, Ralph believes he is a spy, but it's one and the same guy, so does Ralph have an inconsistent belief. This is supposed to be a serious puzzle. Now, I have argued that there are not two different kinds of belief or two different kinds of statements, de re and de dicto. They're all de dicto. But rather, sometimes in making a report, you can report a belief in a way that commits you, the reporter, to the existence of the object that the belief is supposed to be about. So you as a reporter can say, now, I'm going to tell you about Ralph. About that guy at the beach, Ralph believes he's not a spy. Now that is a de re report because that commits you, the person making the report, to the existence of a guy at the beach. Or you can give a de dicto report. You can say, I'm going to tell you about Ralph. Ralph believes that there was this guy at the beach and that guy is not a spy. Now that doesn't commit you. That leaves it open whether or not there really was such a person. You can then add consistently, but there never was such a guy. The whole thing was a hallucination. So there are not two kinds of beliefs, de re beliefs and de dicto beliefs, but they're rather two different kinds of reports. And the proof is very simple. If there were two different kinds of beliefs, then Ralph ought to be able to make the distinction. He ought to be able to say, now I'm going to have a de re belief and not a de dicto belief. But from Ralph's point of view, it's the same belief. If Ralph says, here's what I believe, about that guy at the beach, he's not a spy, or he says, about that guy at the beach, I believe he's not a spy, it's the same belief in the two cases. Why? Because the conditions of satisfaction are exactly the same. Remember how intentionality works. By their conditions of satisfaction shall ye know them. You'll know what a belief is if you know what's supposed to make it true or false. Well, okay, another argument against internalism was supposed to be the referential attributive argument. And the idea was that neither Strawson nor Russell could account for the referential cases because in those cases the description that the agent actually gave, that the speaker actually gave, was false of the person being referred to. So the man who murdered Smith is insane, says the speaker, pointing to a guy, not to you guys, an imaginary guy in the corner. And he refers to that guy, even if that guy was not the murderer of Smith. And I've argued that's not a good argument either, because in every case where the referential use succeeds, where you actually succeed in picking out an object, the speaker has other resources to fall back on. What does the speaker say when you say to him, well, that guy didn't actually kill Smith? If the speaker says, well, I was talking about that guy. I don't care if he killed Smith or not. That guy is insane. But if he said, well, I don't care about that guy, I'm talking about whoever it was, then that would be a case of what Donnellan calls the attributive use. But that's not a different semantics. That's just a different set of ways we have of identifying objects. And if it turns out that the actual description we give is false of the object we're trying to refer to, then we can fall back on it. And then in the so-called referential cases, the speaker has other descriptions he can fall back on. Well, one last argument I want to consider is Kripke's argument about rigid designators and the causal theory of names. A rigid designator, you remember, refers to the same object in all possible counterfactual situations. So it makes sense to say Benjamin Franklin was the inventor of the rocking chair, but the inventor of the rocking chair might have been somebody else. You know, maybe Thomas Jefferson could have invented the rocking chair. But it doesn't make sense to say Benjamin Franklin could have been somebody else, because Benjamin Franklin is a rigid designator and always refers to the same object in different counterfactual situations. Now, that's not to say somebody couldn't use the name Benjamin Franklin to name their dog. I mean, that's what I do. All my dogs are named after famous philosophers. But the point is that given the meaning of the word is fixed, given a fixed semantics of the word, then a rigid designator always refers to the same object in different possible circumstances. Now, that seems to me right about proper names. There are some proper names that are not rigid designators when you don't know much about the guy. The hillside strangler, you might give him a name, call him Bob, and then you really aren't clear which person who Bob is. You don't know which person is Bob because you've only identified him with a definite description, which is not a rigid designator. But in general, it seems to me right. But it doesn't seem to me to have anything like the philosophical significance that Kripke attaches to it, because of course any definite description at all can be made rigid by simply indexing it to the actual world. So I say, look, the actual inventor of bifocals was Benjamin Franklin, and then I go on to say, but the actual inventor of bifocals might not have been the inventor of bifocals. He might have been worried about something else on that particular day. So that's a case where I index something to the actual world by saying, well, I'm talking about the actual person who invented bifocals, and I'm talking about that very person, even in a world, even in a possible state of affairs in which he didn't invent bifocals. So any definite description can always be made rigid. You can rigidify it by indexing it to the actual world. However, the really deep problem is this, and now I'm going to state my dissatisfaction with the whole tradition. It seems to me the entire tradition of discussing reference in the philosophy of language suffers from a perfectly general mistake. And the mistake is to suppose that when we explain reference, we can assume a prior inventory of objects. There are all these objects out there. There's Benjamin Franklin. There's the inventor of bifocals. There's the first president of the United States. There's the Queen of England. But unfortunately, there's not a King of France, and that means we got a puzzle about him. But the whole discussion assumes that we're entitled to assume an inventory of pre-existing objects. And then the question is, and how do these names succeed in referring to those objects? Is it because of a causal relation, a la Kripke, or because of they satisfy a condition, according to Frege? But what I want to suggest is we ought to examine that assumption. Where do these objects come from? We're not entitled to assume that the pre-linguistic organism is confronted with an inventory of previously identified and categorized objects. Now you might say, well, look, of course we are, because the world does contain trees and forests and rivers and stones and lakes and all of these things. They exist regardless of how anybody categorizes them. And in a way, that's right. But here's the point I'm making. If you assume the animal confronts an environment, and you assume that the environment is structured by certain causal features, then the fact that the animal will impose certain categories on that environment will be a function of the structure of the animal and how it relates to the causal features. So it's true that the animals we're thinking about would probably immediately be able to discriminate trees and stones. But if we imagine that the animal is the size of an amoeba, is perfectly a conscious amoeba, then it seems to me unlikely it's going to be interested in trees. Or if the animal's the size of a galaxy, let the animal be the size of the Milky Way galaxy, then again it's unlikely to be interested in trees. So it's philosophically begging the question. And I gave you the example of how you might imagine an object constructed out of half of this and a piece of the table. It's philosophically begging the question to assume that the animal confronts a set of already categorized objects. Rather, the categorization that emerges has to be a function of the structure of the way the molecules are behaving and the animal's cognitive structure. But what that means is that the capacity to identify something as an object and to attach a name to an object cannot be taken for granted because, of course, the very same capacity that we use for referring to objects is the capacity that enables us to categorize something as an object in the first place. See, people talk as if it were quite simple to name an object. I mean, Ruth Marcus says, think of proper names as like labels on a bottle. But the capacity to recognize a label and its functioning on a bottle is a prodigious intellectual capacity. How do you know that the label isn't the name of the bottle or the name of itself or the name of the cap on the bottle? Well, you know that, but all of those are part of your background abilities. And again, back to my dog Gilbert. He's very intelligent, but he cannot use labels on bottles. He lacks the cognitive capacity to do that. So the idea that somehow or other all we've got to have is a causal link connecting us to the initial baptism, and that causal link will be sufficient to explain reference. That seems to me exactly the same mistake as to suppose all you've got to have is a causal connection between the object and the ostensive definition. I say, this is glug, and then you know the meaning of the word. But of course, you don't know the meaning of the word. All the details have to be filled in. So the idea that you know the meaning of the word Socrates because there's a causal chain that stretches back to Socrates, that begs the question. You already have to know something about Socrates to know what to look for at the end of the causal chain. That's a circular argument. Suppose a guy got, according to the standard view, he got the causal chain, he hears the word Socrates and he intends to refer to the same person or the same object from the other people that he got the name, but he mistakenly supposes that the word Socrates is the name of a prime number. So he says, well, Socrates ends in 37, ends in 7, but it's larger than 37, but less than 100. So we ought to be able to figure out which one Socrates is. Is that guy referring to Socrates? I don't think so. He satisfies all the conditions. But if you don't know that Socrates is the name of a man, or at least a sentient animal, maybe it could turn out that Socrates was really a very smart chimpanzee, though I'm not sure about that. But the cognitive apparatus, the conceptual apparatus, already constrains what sort of things can be referred to by a word like Socrates. And indeed, there are certain counterexamples of a real-life historical kind. One, Gareth Evans pointed out, the word Madagascar does not originally name an island off the African coast. It originally named part of the African mainland. But Marco Polo picked it up from native users, and he thought he was using it to name the same thing they were naming, but he used it to refer to an island off the African mainland, and that has stuck. So the causal chain doesn't end on the African mainland. It goes back it doesn't end on the island, which we now call Madagascar. It goes back to the African mainland. Anyway, I think that's kind of a trivial example, but the deep point, and the point I want to make is that we have to ask the question, what is an object? And that's part of our answer to the question, well, what is language? Because what counts as an object is a function of the cognitive apparatus that we bring to bear, and it's that same cognitive apparatus that enables us to use language and refer to objects. You cannot explain reference to an object without first explaining what is an object. Well, what is an object? Well, there are two formal features that objects require. You've got to have individuation and you've got to have identity. Now, what does that mean? Individuation means you've got to be able to tell what is one object and what's two objects. So if you have capacity for individuation, you'll spot this as one and this as distinct. These objects are distinct. But now a second feature in addition to individuation is you've got to have identity. You've got to be able to say, well, this is the same hat as the hat that I wore last week, and this is the same briefcase as the one I brought here last week. Now it gets fuzzy because some objects, like clouds, don't have clear criteria of individuation and identity. Is that one cloud or two clouds that mush overhead? And is it the same cloud as that we saw yesterday? It's not clear how we're going to be able to answer those questions, yet we do have the notion of cloud. So our favorite objects are things that are more or less existing three-dimensional phenomena like stones and trees, or if you're indoors, chairs and tables, and they do have, and of course people, and people do have the condition of individuation and identity. We'd be in a hell of a fix if people routinely underwent fission and fusion. So if I'm walking down the street and I suddenly split into 5 guys, well, that would be a mess. Whose driver's license is it? Who owns the house? Whose income tax is it? Or fusion would also be bad if we're walking down the street and suddenly we coalesce like drops of water, and so there's only one person left. Well, which one is the person who's left? Fortunately, it doesn't work like that. Now, that's because we don't reproduce the way amoeba do, just by fission. The amoeba wants to be two amoeba, it just splits. We can't do that. We have this very inefficient method of biparental reproduction, which, as you know, can produce all sorts of social problems, neuroses, unhappiness, romantic poetry, and other sorts of social pathologies. But it does have certain advantages. Biparental reproduction gives us pretty clear conditions of identity, and also it mixes the genes. That's a great advantage to biparental reproduction. It mixes up the genes in a way we wouldn't get mixed genes if we just went around undergoing fission whenever we wanted to reproduce ourselves. Okay, so I'm now going to shift gears. I'm going to come back to this topic. Here is the topic. The entire tradition, including my own writings on the subject, seems to me at fault because they don't start with a question, what is a thing anyhow? What's an object anyhow? And we've got to answer that question. Now, once you give an answer to that question, then you're off and running with noun phrases, and you're then going to say what I think most philosophers really think. An object is anything you can refer to with a noun phrase. The problem with that is you can make some pretty funny noun phrases, like instead of saying Socrates is bald, you can say Socrates has the property of baldness. And now you got a new object, the property of baldness. And you're often running with philosophy because now you have the problem of universals. You invent. See, Gilbert can't do that. He can. We might train him to tell bald people from not bald people, but he cannot distinguish between that guy's bald and that guy has the property of baldness, Or much less can he distinguish those from the property of baldness is that guy instantiated. And why do we talk the way we do? Why do we say Socrates is bald instead of the property of baldness Socratizes? Treats Socrates as an activity of the property of baldness. Why not? I mean, we're all philosophers now. Why is it that we say the one and not the other? We could. I guess somebody says, well, was Socrates bald? And I say, no, you got it wrong. There is this property, baldness, and among the things that property did was, in ancient Greece, it Socratized. I don't know if it Platonized, but it did Socratize. Okay, we know that from statues of Socrates, that baldness Socratized. What's wrong with that? All right, now we're into deep stuff, and it's deeper stuff than you normally get when you read Frege and Russell and these guys. I'm going to come back to it because it's about the very nature of intentionality. However, we got a new topic, truth. And I'm going to tell you about truth. We're going to get started on the topic of truth for the next 5 minutes. Okay. It often arises in philosophy that you have heavy-duty, really deep philosophical problems because you have conflicting intuitions. You have conflicting inclinations. And about the adjective true, there are two absolutely conflicting inclinations. One is, I'll put these very crudely, one is truth is a big deal. People have been willing to fight for the truth. The other inclination is to say the word true is no big deal at all, because for any statement expressed by the sentence S, S is true if and only if P, where P, you get P, the proposition P, just by rewriting S. The famous example is the statement snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. Now that's one of the examples, like the King of France, that is so much that it's been fought over for so many generations. But the principle is this: S is true if and only if P, where for S you put a sentence and with quotation marks. And the favorite example is this one: snow is white. This sentence is true if and only if snow is white. But what does that tell you? That tells you, since you can do that for any statement, any truth whatever, you can do this maneuver. Truth is not a big deal. It's just a shorthand way, or if you like, a longhand way of saying what the statement says. It's true that snow is white says nothing more nor less than snow is white. Nothing is added. And this principle whereby you drop the quotation marks is called disquotation. So for any true statement, or any statement at all, you can do disquotation. You can say, the statement that such and such is true if and only if such and such. Does everybody see this point? Snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. And you get on the right-hand side the very same sentence you had on the left-hand side minus the quotation marks. That's why it's called disquotation. Now, Tarski also called it, in the English translation, convention T. The convention that for any statement, whatever, he called it convention W because he's writing in German, but in the Wahrheit, but in English it's convention T. And convention T says, for any statement whatever, you can state the truth conditions of that statement simply by repeating the statement without the quotation marks. Snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. You have the same thing on the right-hand side as on the left-hand side, minus the quotation marks. But now, on the one hand, we're inclined to say, no, come on, truth has got to be a bigger deal than that, because this says truth, or seems to say, truth is redundant. You could get rid of the word true. Instead of going around saying it's true that snow is white, just say snow is white. You don't have to use the word true. It doesn't actually play any role And the extreme version, this is called the redundancy theory of truth, that says truth is redundant. Now, some people say, well, it's not quite redundant. You want to be able to say things like, everything the policeman said on the witness stand was true. And there, you don't know what he said, but you might know that it was true. But you can still get a kind of a disquotation of that. You can say for every statement S that he uttered, expressing a proposition P, then if he uttered S, then P. I mean, you could do that. You could get a kind of disquotation, but you still, it looks like the word true is useful other than just being completely redundant, because you sometimes want to summarize and say, well, everything written in that book is true, or everything written in that book is false. But still, disquotation is the key to truth, and that's called a minimalist theory of truth. It's not totally redundant, but it doesn't do much. So here's our tension. On the one hand, we want to say truth is a big deal. We'd all die for the truth. But nobody says, I'm willing to die for disquotation. You know, it's just not a great rallying cry. The American Constitution defends disquotation. The First Amendment right to disquotation, we'll all fight for that. It just does not seem like a very big deal. Okay, so what about truth? Is it a big deal or not? Well, I'll go on with that on Thursday.